Well, thanks again to Bishop Stewart for overseeing my induction into this role, and thank you very much, David, for your kind introduction and for leading us through this evening. I'm also very thankful to the staff of St Mark's, especially to Hazel Francis, for the incredible effort that they've gone to put on tonight, to make tonight possible, and particularly to Jeanette's sons, Josh and Dan and Ben, and to Taylor for coming this morning and helping set things up, and to Hazel's daughters, Jen and Liz, for helping us with parking tonight. Very thankful to Bishop Stephen and the board of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. Thank you for your use of the facility tonight. And I appreciate your coming tonight. For those I haven't met, it's an odd way to meet, but it's a good way. And I appreciate you coming out to participate very much. I'm so glad that my family is here and some very dear friends who've travelled several hours from our old space. I'm also very thankful for the welcome and hospitality of those in this new space who have extended us every courtesy and civility. I'm speaking tonight on theology in a new space, but what are we getting at with this notion of space? Initially, when I come to Canberra, I find space in the literal sense. I love that Canberra has made the openness of our country inherent to its design. After living in a cluttered and dense environment, it's a joy to ride around the lake and walk the parks, notwithstanding some moments of agoraphobia compared to the cramped conditions of our recent past. But of course, by theology in a new space, I'll mainly consider doing theology in a different social context. Between you and I, this talk really only begins that task. You're still working me out, and I'm still discovering my new context. I hope you'll think of my words tonight as the beginning of a conversation and of a relationship. It matters for me to discover what matters to you, and it's usually in people's misunderstandings and even conflicts that we discover what matters most to one another. I hope we can begin that process well. I'll observe how the new space for me is not so new for St Mark's. I'll touch on theology's new context in Australia. We'll revisit a prophet finding his theology upset by a new space. Then I'll say about theology in Australian public space. But it turns out that we can't only speak of space metaphorically. The vastness of Australia does affect us. So toward the end, I'll tell of how physical spaces become places and how we might sustain them. The exciting thing about St Mark's as a new context for me is something not at all new for St Mark's. Let me contrast with a certain sandstone university near where I used to live, where we strolled our dog. Most striking in that space is the surge of new glass and steel monoliths as this institution seeks to assert its preeminence in various spheres. These structures dwarf me and leave me feeling as if I've woken up inside a dystopian science fiction movie. I'm no architect, but to me these buildings seem beyond brutalist in a way that makes the building that we're now in seem really very cosy. And I mention all this because on our strolls, I've been equally struck by a most down-at-heel, ancient weatherboard demountable parked on a derelict block next to the maintenance shed. There's the maintenance shed. The building I'm referring to was the Interfaith Chaplaincy Hut, the only manifestation of theology visible in this terrain. Now, alas, I waited too long to photograph it. When I finally arrived with my camera, the only thing left was a pile of weatherboards and an awning promising an improved campus. Perhaps the chaplaincy hut was up for a glass and steel facelift. Well, when we consulted virtual space for the whereabouts of the chaplains, we were directed to a room in the so-called transient building. A corrugated iron monolith festooned with utility piping and which has apparently been transient for at least half a century. Were I the chaplains, I should wistfully long for the weatherboard hut. The Australian academic Paul Oslington, building on the work of Bruce Kay and John Gascoigne, argues that universities in Australia were not explicitly founded in opposition to theology. It's easy, he says, for contemporary observers to imagine that the founders of our oldest universities were a bunch of 19th century Christopher Hitchenses or Richard Dawkinses, keeping the dangerous nonsense of religion well away from the impressionable youth of the colony. Such an image, unfortunately, does not fit the historical evidence. In Australia, the exclusion of the churches was not a rejection of the truth claims or the social utility of religion, but a desire to keep the ugly sectarian side of religion and clerical squabbles out of Australia's new universities. The founders wanted to run a university, not referee a rolling fight between the Anglican hierarchy, the Catholics, powerful Presbyterians and others in the colony. Oslington points to the magnificent sandstone colleges at the university I strolled around, founded denominationally to religiously educate students in respect of their convictions. The university now also auspices a department that seeks to study religion ethically and respectfully. Even so, whatever the history and whatever the merits of that department, one can't help but wonder if a kind of passive aggression is at work here in that weatherboard hut, that transient building surrounded triumphal by shining glass and steel. Such a separation is unusual internationally, says Oslington, not just in Europe, where the ancient universities grew from theological faculties, but also in other Anglophone settler societies. Against this backdrop of separation, Christians formed independent seminaries, and I honour them for that. I'm thankful for all the opportunities I was given at one of them, Moore College, whose formation actually predated the neighbouring university. But St Mark's, partnering with UTC, alongside the colleges of St Francis and St Barnabas, forms the School of Theology at CSU, and so has boldly recovered that ancient tradition where universities upheld the training of people for service in the church. Nor has this training been allowed to drift into esoteric theory. CSU has a vibrant tradition of preparing people for actual vocations in the community, particularly in rural and regional areas. The strength of this partnership is that it respects the way the 4 participants in the school are grounded in faith communities. The churches are the lifeblood of this school, as many enrollees come from churches to test and extend their convictions and then return as graduates to serve communities. In the School of Theology, CSU doesn't have a department that only studies religion from a so-called outsider perspective, like most other Enlightenment-shaped tertiary religious studies. The partnership with CSU, that's my little puppy. You like that? We got today. Thought the slide would be kind of, it's a nice logo, but you look at the puppy if you need to. The partnership with CSU represents to me a special kind of space, a safe space to argue and to test ideas. We use university disciplines to lean into our human penchant for mental shortcuts and groupthink. It's diverse in the best sense, where we each learn to embrace the existence of others and their beliefs, whether or not we embrace their ideas for ourselves. That practice expresses what has been called critical tolerance, the capacity to accept the proponent of a position, whether or not we agree with them, and to discover the goods that they are defending, even if we judge that there may be other goods that they have missed. It's a studious place that needs to be defended from the excesses of polemic, even if at times we might respectfully articulate and analyse the content and logic of various others' polemics. Other aspects of St Mark's also express the insider perspective of the faith in Christ of Anglican communities. Our registered training organisation teaches personal and relational counselling from a Christian perspective and assists Anglican ordinands around the country in their vocation. The partnership with the Centre for Ageing and Pastoral Studies assists those in frontline elder care and is a much needed development, given the increasing number of Australians arriving at later life. St Mark's also has historic connections with our neighbours here at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. As you walked in, you may have seen these two expressions of Bishop Bergman's hope for the nation. I'll return to these other aspects of St Mark's as I proceed. If I pan back from St Mark's, of course, all theology now operates in new Australian space. I could tell many stories, but I'll pick up on three shifts that interest me. Firstly, an emboldened new philosophical naturalism, popularly associated with the so-called new atheism, presents itself as the arch-opponent of Christian views of the world. I've been intrigued for a long time by the narratives of naturalism, ranging from its account of the mind through to its accounts of morality and community. It trades on the cultural enterprise we call science, boosts its method into various claims about meaning, and then presents its philosophy as the key to unlock every door. I was interested to see some atheists experimenting with Atheist Sundays, where community gathering, motivational speaking and community service intentionally seek to emulate whatever churches once brought to communities. The narratives of philosophical naturalism then ground what some call secularism, the view that modern public deliberation can only deploy empiricist methodology. These strands in Australian life provoke much anxiety among their opponents, which I think is an overreaction. Nevertheless, they alter the space theology is expected to work in. Second, as one thinker has put it, covetousness today wears very different clothing than it did on Mount Sinai. Covetousness now comes to us in the cloth of self-referential desire, an essential phenomenon of modern-day capitalism. Covetousness is the dominant celebratory pattern of the capitalist religion. When elemental needs are saturated, capitalism must stimulate desire anew. On this view, it isn't simply that we like products. Our polity fetishises desire itself. You'll notice this in those award-winning advertisements that don't commend a product, but that arouse some powerful longing and then sign off with a brand. And so shopping is no longer just the task of buying, but the delightful exposure to commodities of all sorts in the hope that something may eventually stir up our desire. The dynamics of a liberal market economy depend upon the dual assumption of unstoppable, insatiable desire on the one hand and the scarcity of goods on the other. This dynamic combines with the public valorisation of our species' very primal aversion to loss. And I believe that this fetishising of desire actually lies at the root of our really confounded public deliberations about climate change. I also believe it confuses many other public deliberations. And I long for a rapprochement between the Christian right and the Christian left, that we might gather together to examine the distorting effects of late capitalist desire on our shared community life. Theology interrogates the distortions of desire that drive fear and competition and violence. And theology offers life-giving visions of desire finding a proper home. And to gather well around this task would equip us to offer something precious to our nation. But, third, it would seem that theology has come to a very weakened position from which to comment on desire, as the Christian community humbly bears the lash of an inquiry barely begun into the institutional abuse of children. It's notoriously hard for individuals to know where they stand in relation to sins committed by institutional ancestors. When we say, they were not us, or we were not there, we only seek to decrease our own anxiety by absenting ourselves from them. I believe that we have something to learn in this area and in the arena of responding to injustices against Indigenous people from the work of Katharina von Kellenbach on the moral journey of post-war Germany. She describes the false deployment of individualism and the self-justifying use of redemption language to sidestep the enormity of what occurred to Jewish victims. She suggests, well, provocatively, that a better biblical motif might be the mark of Cain, a mark that signified God's protection and mercy, but not in a way that could be taken to erase the moral narrative of what Cain did. His past remained embedded in his moral reintegration as he went on to found a city in the text. Something went wrong in the topography of desire inhabited by our communities and their representatives. They respected adult careers and reputations over the troubled presence of each quiet, withdrawn child and his and her story as each came to maturity. What you love shapes what you notice. Our upcoming Lamentation Sunday becomes an important step in the moral reintegration of the communities who bear this mark of Cain. Now, I've offered a mere glimpse really into Australian theology's new space. Lots of stories that we could tell about that. And in response, I can offer no general principle or theory or approach in reply. For Christians, the person of Jesus Christ comes to us a little infuriatingly as a particular person to whom we respond, not as some overarching theory for us to analyse. As I ponder our relationship to the Australian people, I find myself thinking of Jesus' exasperated riddle on the sign of Jonah. You may recall that incident triggered by some religious carping over Jesus' help for a person with disability. When Jesus pushes back, they press for a sign to prove his authenticity. In a moment of supreme agitation, he shoots back that no sign will be given to them except the sign of Jonah. Such a cryptic comment. The texts take it in two directions. That Jesus' resurrection will be like Jonah's own deliverance, and that rank outsiders seem to know how to turn to God in a way that God's own people do not. People have wondered what else might be conveyed by this sign of Jonah. As Yvonne Sherwood puts it, the very riddling, tangential quality of the Logion ensures its generative capacity, its potential for spawning co-metaphors and enlisting readers in the obsessive hunt to run the elusive sign to the ground. I propose to join that hunt tonight, for Jonah does theology in various new spaces. He has some geographical displacements. More importantly, a lot that he thinks he knows about theology doesn't quite work for him, and he is disoriented and disturbed in unexpected ways. And if you think that I'm hinting that, like Jonah, I have somehow come from Israel to Nineveh, this Jonah turns out to be pompous, self-righteous, vindictive, and very, very dissociated. It reads like a short 4-act play, which I'll quickly recap to offset the odd dismemberings of it committed upon some of us as children. Yahweh, the defender of all good, calls Jonah to speak against the violent evil of Nineveh. So Jonah flees the other way. When a storm pounds his ship, the pagan sailors long for Jonah's God. "Get up, call on your God," the captain implores Jonah. "Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." Jonah piously asserts, "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Yet he's dissociated from this utterance, and only the sailors get it. "What have you done?" they exclaim. Jonah, pompous, seemingly a coward. These sailors working to protect Jonah, calling on God, finally forced to dump Jonah, and then they're delivered. In the second act, Jonah does some theology from a new space, basically from inside of a fish, and his prayer for deliverance is really more flowery than that of the sailors, but as desperate as ever they were. That's a good prayer, it's a pious prayer. a theologically hard default prayer, a psalm-like prayer, trusting the God who cast Jonah down also to lift him up. Oddly, Jonah also finds the time to assert that those who worship vain idols forsake their chesed, the biblical code word for steadfast love. Again, that's technically true. When we attach to small gods, we lose our capacity for steadfast love to one another, and we miss God's steadfast love to us. Yet we've just seen such people, those sailors who each cry to their God, going on to experience God's steadfast love. This Jonah, so theologically pristine, so proper, so thoroughly dislikable. And yet even he is delivered, brought to dry land, so steadfast is God's love. In the third act, Jonah tells Nineveh of God's intention to uphold justice. The king responds, all shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. God does, and they are saved. But this was very displeasing to Jonah, and he became angry. And then follows the book's biggest reveal. That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning. He spits at God. We assumed he was scared of public speaking or of violent Ninevites. But he explains his thinking at the time. I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing, shooting back God's own self-revelation to Moses from Exodus 34 verse 6. Jonah despises how the one who upholds justice also seems so much to love mercy. And the Lord responds, is it right for you to be angry? Petulant to the last, Jonah lives through that object lesson when the vine that shades him dies and he's cranky. And again God says, is it right for you to be angry? You care about a bush, but should I not be more concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals? Evidently, Jesus thought deeply on this story. When Jesus immediately thinks of Jonah, I can't help wondering if the sign of Jonah also picks up on Jonah's toxic attitude and blind spots and dissociation. Jonah knows theology but isn't present to the sailors or the Ninevites or the animals. Likewise, the figures watching Jesus are religiously preoccupied and not present to the needs of the person with disability. Jonah dissociates the truth of theology from seeing the good God upholding justice and delivering with mercy. Those around Jesus dissociate their religious precision about Jesus' identity from seeing the good Jesus upholding justice and delivering with mercy. God's question to Jonah fits equally well upon them. Is it right for you to be angry? This sign, I know, matches myself at my worst, pondering matters of truth while dissociated from the presence of others and from the excellence of God's just mercy. Jonah inhabits a theological mind gone sour. And if we can recognise ourselves here as individuals, I wonder if we can recognise it in collectives too, for after all, Jesus delivers this word to a generation. Am I being too harsh to wonder if our Anglican tribes sometimes feel like Jonah? We're inducted into ways of seeing the world, often at a very young age, that leave us preoccupied with truth at the expense of being present to others, and clergy can particularly torture each other in this regard. Perhaps God also says to us, is it right for you to be angry? And calls to us to remember all of those teeming around us who long in various ways for deliverance. Now, of course, I oversimplify. Many Anglicans care deeply for their neighbour. Plenty of Australians don't seem to want deliverance, and I'll return to that. We conflict over weighty matters. Bishop Driver has recently written on intra-Anglican conflict with real gravitas. Harmony becomes too easily romanticised and often fails to notice how the incarnate Son knew serious conflict. But even so, Jonah's dissociated doctrine turns him bitter and toxic and God first addresses his spirit. Is it right for you to be angry? I want to participate in a place free from that kind of toxicity and to heed this sign of Jonah, along with repenting like a Ninevite and hoping in the resurrection. The reputation of this diocese goes before it as a place where difference is met with calm respect. May that strength lead the national church, and from within that space, may we be present to struggling Australians in all their naturalism and secularism, in their fetishising of desire, in their grief and anger at the church's sins, and in the myriad stories that we haven't told. Particularly in its university setting and in its alliance with this centre. St Mark's does its theology with a view to those around us, but consider what modern Australians contend with. At least the sailors and the Ninevites knew of gods in his book A Secular Age. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor paints a sweeping panorama of what has shifted between the 16th and the 21st centuries. Back in the day, it was not hard to believe in God. Now, believers keep checking in on the believability of their faith, and unbelief is haunted by temptations to believe. To dwell within this space is to experience what Taylor calls cross-pressure. Taylor argues that a momentous change has occurred in what he calls our social imaginary, which is to say how we construe what surrounds us. In J.K.A. Smith's summary, it's the move from a cosmos to a universe. The move of spontaneously imagining our cosmic environment as an ordered, layered, hierarchical, shepherded place, to spontaneously imagining our cosmic environment as an infinite, cavernous, anonymous space. Oh, I like my family's first experience of Canberra, actually. In a cavernous universe that may or may not have meaning, you are forced to inhabit what Taylor calls a buffered self, an identity walled off, in a sense, from the rest of it. For the modern buffered self, says Taylor, the possibility exists of taking a distance from, disengaging from everything outside of the mind. My ultimate purposes are those that arise within me. The crucial meanings of things are those defined in my responses to them. Disengagement is frequently carried out in relation to one's whole surroundings, natural and social. A buffered self must then embark upon a quest for meaning in what Taylor says has become the so-called age of authenticity. The age defined by seeking what's authentic from within that buffered self. We're the generation that wants to find what matters, but who don't yet know how to find it in a way that we can trust. In my own story, the person and work of Jesus stabilises me, testifying that we are somehow known by God, safe in God's mercy, and calling me to rediscover how to be a creature in a creation and how to participate in God's deliverance of the world. But others will come here at different points in their quest, and they are very welcome. And I hope St Mark's remains a safe oasis for all comers to explore the intricacies of what Taylor describes. I hope that people can find something of what I've found, and of course they remain welcome whatever happens. If I've lofted you a little by referring to Charles Taylor, then join in the fun again as I simply recount a story from Bishop Bergman. We could talk about his advocacy for various social justice causes, but this story neatly illustrates his concern for the travails of everyday Australians. Remember too, as I read this, that Bergman had all the skills of someone who grew up in the bush, as he recounts this meeting with two bullock team drivers on the road. I remember when I'd become a parson, falling in with two bullock teams hopelessly bogged. I saw at once that they were asking their teams to do an impossible thing. It was an uphill pull and all the wheels were sinking deeper every time they moved at all. I got off my horse and asked if I could help. I was not made to feel particularly welcome, And I knew very well how the presence of a parson could cramp a bullock driver's style. But I quietly got a stick and kept the bullocks up to their job. Then I ventured to suggest some different methods. I knew I had to work tactfully. The fellows tried to be civil, but I knew they wished me far away. However, I was on my own ground even if they didn't know it. As their efforts proved more and more hopeless, they showed signs of being ready to listen. By this time I had worked out a solution so that the holes that they were in could be avoided. My plan was at length accepted, and I directed the doings. In a very short time, all was well, and I rode off quickly to make up for the lost time. A day or two later, the drivers turned up at church. They remarked to a friend, "That B parson knows more about bullock driving than we know ourselves." He goes on, "I like bullock drivers very much. They're among my most respected teachers. The idea that they are exceedingly profane is greatly exaggerated. Most of them make a clear distinction between clean swearing and foul language. The former was an art, the latter was ruled out as low. Most of the swearing in the bush in my day was clean. Some of the drivers had an exceedingly picturesque vocabulary and a distinct feeling for the right word. In other circumstances, they may have become literary artists." There's nothing Jonah-like about Bergman. His respectful connection with people reminds me of James Davidson Hunter's vision for public theology, which he calls faithful presence. Writing in the US context, Hunter rejects the methods and motivations of the political Christian left and the political Christian right and of Anabaptist separatism. A theology of faithful presence, says Hunter, begins with an acknowledgement of God's faithful presence to us, and that his call upon us is that we be faithfully present to him in return. It follows that we become those who pursue others, identify with others, and labour towards the fullness of others through sacrificial love. Faithful presence takes seriously each person's sphere of influence, particularly their workplaces. Within these spheres of influence, Christians become a kind of joyful resistance who seek new patterns of social organisation that challenge, undermine and otherwise diminish oppression, injustice, enmity and corruption, and in turn encourage harmony, fruitfulness and abundance, wholeness, beauty, joy, security and well-being. Not so much a direct opposition through a contest of power, but a bursting out of an alternative within the proper space of the old, and with that forceful prophetic opposition becoming a kind of mode of last resort, as it were. I look forward to exploring this kind of faithful presence in partnership with the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, equipping workers to lean back into their workplaces for the good of Australia, alongside, of course, those more traditional modes of advocacy. And in this respect, the RTO side of St Mark's already quietly enacts the arts and competencies of faithful presence. Our counselling trainers offer precisely the kinds of skills needed to properly hear and meet another. The gifts and skills of our counsellors show how to value someone for what they are, not for what we wish they'd become, whilst also holding out the hope of change. Our courses in Anglican theology and ministry assist people to come alongside others in a variety of modes of care and worship and instruction. Under the Centre for Ageing and Pastoral Studies, several courses shape people into those who come alongside others in their later life. The St Mark's RTO is an extraordinary national asset, pioneering capacity, the capacity to connect with others in daily moments, and I hope we can find ways to extend that work. Taylor noted how people can see themselves as tiny beings in an infinite, cavernous, anonymous space, and in a country as vast as Australia, that becomes literally true. Anglican relationships become distorted by the attenuations of distance. Lonely, regional and remote Australians hunger for connection. To address that, I'll end with some reflections on physical space by the British thinker Oliver O'Donovan. Place is the social communication of space. Space has no boundaries of its own, he says, although geographical features such as seas, deserts and mountain ranges do shape the social possibilities that arise among them. But O'Donovan thinks we do better to regard a space as a place when the people in a space take one another seriously enough to communicate good to one another in faithful presence to one another. When our relationships communicate what's good, a space becomes a place. O'Donovan warns against trying to abolish or escape from place into placelessness. We pretend that space is irrelevant when we just retreat into principles and so on in the life of the mind. He opposes the attempt to master space by carving it up as ownership. The assumption that land not in private ownership was terra nullius became, as he puts it, a terrible engine of colonial conquest. Maybe we non-Indigenous Australians can each remember that shocking realisation that a vibrant place of social communication long predated us. I also acknowledge the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, past and present, on whose ancestral land we stand. It's a high achievement to define society in terms of place rather than blood relationship, language, economic practice or whatever. And over the years, this sprawling bushland site, with its disparate buildings, its eclectic mix of subjects, its unique mix of faculty and its range of enrollees, has become a place, a society, not defined by standard tribal markers. The very English O'Donovan goes on to gripe about how internet relationships make communications between people too attenuated across distance, so breaking down a proper sense of place. I beg to differ, as folks far and wide around Australia become communicant members of this place in Barton, thanks to the dedicated CSU distance education by our faculty and the travelling teams of our RTO. When I first came to St Mark's, I asked the staff what they valued about this place. They spoke of a worshipful, intellectual community gathered around Jesus Christ who makes this space a place. As I've come to know past and present students of this place, I find a quiet love for it that runs very deep. I recognise and respect that. In every way that I've mentioned, St Mark's already punches well above its weight on the national scene. That's what attracted me to participating with you. We consider it a privilege to be invited to this Christian community. To those who had a say in that, I thank you. I value the opportunity for a new start here. And as I navigate my new space, I undertake this night to do everything in my power to uphold and extend everything good about this precious, long-standing place. Thank you.